Yeah, I'm coming from Centerville, Tennessee, which is a little south of Nashville. I'm originally from California. Um, but yeah, this talk is, I'm not really a formal speaker. I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker, but I can definitely talk about this. Um, the opening question I have is, what is it that seeks? Before there's any spiritual path, any philosophy, any practice, or any belief, there's an assumption that I am here and that something important is missing. Seeking begins as a sense of incompleteness. Something happens early. It's a felt sense of lack, of separation, of needing to be made whole, to make what doesn't feel quite right feel right. You know, the mind names this, I am the one who is seeking something that's missing. The naming creates a someone who wasn't there before, or it clarifies the one that was already assumed to be existing there. And whether it's seeking money, relationships, enlightenment, peace, God, truth, or self-realization, the movement is fundamentally the same. What I am is not enough. Something else will complete me. The character begins collecting beliefs, practices, teachers, experiences. The seeker is not a person, though. It's a mental process run by the mind. My seeking began subtly. I was seeking before I was even consciously noticing that I was seeking. Started at a very young age. I was just 6 years old when I witnessed a man commit suicide. And from then on, I was constantly trying to control life, struggling and fighting with life, terrified of life, often trying to fix circumstances to force them to fit, to make them go my way. Mm. This included trying to intimidate others to do what I needed them to do to get my way, um, whatever I felt would go my way. I also often challenged authority because authority figures often seem to, sorry, often seem to become obstacles of getting in my way and getting what I wanted. Um, with challenge, I would challenge their rules with my own clever philosophies and pushing back against whatever rules they had. And anyone that seemed to present themselves as an authority figure would often be attacked, mostly psychologically, but I also became extremely physically violent. Violence seemed to be a part of my daily life. The world seemed to be very violent, so for me, it seemed to be reasonable for me to be violent. And this didn't really help because, in a sense, it seemed to protect me, but it also created more violence in my life. And I had people trying to take my life. Something that start off as just simply as looking at someone a certain way would soon have them chasing me down the street with a gun. These behavior patterns led me into many disciplining situations at home and at school. And the staff kept telling me that my behavior would lead me to either prison or into an early grave. And so I surrounded myself with notorious validated gang members and started getting arrested and was charged with committing violent felonies as a teenager. I began to really distrust the system, law enforcement, courts, staff at juvenile facilities, teachers at schools. So I continued my criminal ways, even while being locked up. Eventually, I became a very proud truth seeker, and my I became a conspiracy theorist, and which reinforced my identity of being manipulated by the government, the media, what I called the sheeple. I looked at as not awake to the system that seemed to worship them, and thus this reinforced the idea that I, along with everyone else, belonged in a framework of us versus them. And this made me feel very much like a victim, very much isolated, because I thought at times when I had some kind of truth that people would reject that, and then I'd feel even more isolated, more desperate. This made it seem more insurmountable to what I was trying to reach. And I wasn't even sure what it was I was trying to reach because it seemed like the goalposts were moved all the time. Every time I'd reach a certain uh, idealism, it didn't turn out to be what I thought it might be. And then I would leave that path and go on to another path, doing the same thing repeatedly over and over again. This made everything seem, um, distant in a way. And I blamed all my circumstances on what life was doing out there as the world pushing in on me. Before this worldview began to collapse into hopelessness, which I was deathly afraid of. I was more afraid of hopelessness, feeling hopeless, than dying. And the idea of committing suicide seemed to give me a sense of relief. I became more desperate, feeling more isolated due to all the seeking, primarily outwardly focused. It was the world's fault, not mine. Then it began to turn inward, and I began to look at myself, which was incredibly painful at first, as it seemed to validate what was true, that something was wrong with me after all. And it was something I often heard from my peers and adults in authority roles while growing up, but it was something deep down I was terrified might be true. In a way, this turning inward, although initially was painful, begins to feel more like a bit of relief as I begin to take responsibility for everything I seem to be involved in. So it gave me a sense of power. And I no longer was really trying to force the world to change anymore. Now I was changing myself. Forcefully, in a way. I couldn't get the world to change, and it seemed like all my efforts were pointless. It didn't make my life any better. If anything, it only seemed to make my life a lot worse. And a more of a serious matter, an existential matter. I couldn't awaken the world, but the shift brought the seeking closer and more immediate to me. I can waken myself up, was the thought. More than what I assumed I already was. I had no idea those beliefs I was so sure about being awakened would become questionable too. Being that my life became even more serious, all my seeking became more evident, and the seeking in turn became a serious matter in itself. And so I began seeking more spiritually. First, I went with my identity and conditioning, with my family history being identified as Roman Catholics. So I'd been attending Catholic services. At first, I felt it was too hierarchical, so I left that and got involved with Protestantism. But when things were going well for me, I didn't go to church. I only read the Bible while I was at church. I was a wishy-washy Christian. I followed this pattern all through my 20s. When things would get hard, I'd show back up at the church. I felt that when things got hard, it was God calling me back to go to church to get myself straightened out again. And as soon as I would, things would start moving smoothly again, and I'd go back into not showing up again, not even reading the Bible, nothing. It just would just go back into my ways. I was often going in and out of jail, mostly for petty issues like refusing to pay a traffic ticket, not showing up for court, and then a bench warrant was issued, and it would turn into jail time for something that wasn't even starting off as jail time. And so I'd end up on probation, and I would violate those terms repeatedly and turn a minor matter into a misdemeanor and more jail time. It wasn't unusual for me to get out of jail, and within a month later, I'd be right back into jail again. And eventually, at the age of 30, I landed in California State Prison in the CDCR prison system on a 5-year prison sentence. And this is where I experienced a radical shift in my mental conditioning and seemed to experience a dark night of the soul and a Kundalini awakening. So I went all in at that point and becoming a Christian, as that was the only spiritual thing I seemed to be aware of. I continued with that path after paroling home for another 5 years after leaving prison. Then I ended up walking away from religion entirely, not sure what to do, because I felt everyone that I went into was not really holding on to the truth. Still identified as a truth seeker, wanting to get to know God, still believing in Jesus, but I just didn't feel like the Christian church had it. And so I jumped into NLP, neuro linguistic programming, to change beliefs with more beliefs. This seemed to lead me into the law of attraction. All the time that I could put into understanding the law of attraction, I did, like cramming for a college exam, like my entire future depended on it. I was convinced and had many others convinced we create our own realities. And I believed I manifested a life that exceeded my wildest dreams. And I began writing a book on law of attraction that I almost finished, but despite feeling I finally had real control and power to create my own reality, at the peak of it, I couldn't hide this feeling of deep dissatisfaction. And I ended up dropping it all. I finally seemed to understand how people I thought were living their best dreams would commit suicide. I mean, if you had felt that you attained the most successful outcome possible and you're still feeling empty inside, what is left? But I nearly committed suicide while I was in prison. I wasn't interested in killing myself at this point, at least not yet. I had been coming across online people posting quotes online from Ramana Maharshi, and every quote I came across just deeply resonated with me. So I sold my shares of the company I was brought into by my business partners back to them, and I decided I would use the money to support myself while I dove deeply into non-duality. I didn't go looking for non-duality like I did all these other paths. It just seemed to show up as if it came looking for me. And so this was like my last final hurrah. If it didn't work out, I was already thinking maybe then I would be ready to end my life. Most spiritual paths promise that you'll eventually arrive somewhere. The seeker is taken as the starting premise, the one who needs to be fixed, freed, or enlightened. Seeking reinforces the seeker. Every search confirms there's a searcher. Even progress deepens the story. I'm getting closer equals I'm the one that needs to get there. The trap of spiritual accumulation of insights, states, lineages, and identity goes on. The subtle echo of the awakened seeker. Now I'm someone who almost has it. Meditation, inquiry, devotion, none of it is wrong. But who is doing it and why? The exhaustion that eventually sets in is not a failure, but is a clue. But what if the seeker itself is the problem the seeker is trying to solve? Seeking is a paradox. It's a mechanism and the obstacle. The innocence of seeking is not wrong. It is a natural expression of the human experience. Most of us cannot simply be told there's nothing to find. The search itself seems necessary. The desire to know and understand, to find freedom, is genuine. If I had not sought, I would not have discovered the limitations of seeking. The promise that seeking makes is that it always points to our future fulfillment. It says one more insight, one more retreat, one more book, one more awakening. It continually postpones arrival. The horizon always moves. Chasing the horizon, every step seems to bring you closer, yet the horizon never arrives. There's a hidden assumption. Seeking depends on an unquestioned belief. There is a seeker. We spend years investigating reality. We investigate consciousness. We investigate God. We investigate the experience. Yet rarely do we investigate the one who claims ownership of the search. Who exactly is seeking? The seeker becomes the object of investigation. At some point, the intention turns around. Instead of asking what is truth, the question becomes who wants truth? Instead of how do I become free, the question becomes who is it that needs freedom? This is a major shift. The search is no longer directed outward as to what is the true spiritual path. You begin looking for the seeker. What is the seeker made of? Is it found as an actual entity? Or is it a collection of thoughts, memories, images, narratives, and expectations? Can a thinker be found apart from the thought? Can a seeker be found apart from the seeking? At some point, seeking stops working, not because you quit, but because something sees through it. You know, the quality of that moment is not arrival, but falling through the floor. It seems obvious the world had no answers, and now spirituality seemed to completely fail. It is very disorienting. There's no moment when the seeker becomes free. There's a recognition that the seeker was never really a subject, and the one who was supposed to arrive never existed. And that is what I have named my upcoming album, No One Arrived. You just heard that first song. Well, that's actually not on the album, but that's a song that was actually relates to all this. There's a strange discovery. The seeker appears substantial when assumed, but when examined directly, it becomes difficult to locate. There are thoughts about a self, and we call that mental processing selfing, but there is no self to be found at the center of it, nor some entity as the causation behind it making it happen. Memories about a self, stories about a self, but where is the actual owner of experience? It seems it is an experience, not the experiencer it presents itself to be. Life continues, but without the engine of lack running underneath it. This isn't a flatness or a detachment. It's full-on presence without agenda. The difference between doing and being done through. The residue is like habits of seeking can persist even after this realization. Thoughts still arise saying something's missing, but they don't go unnoticed as the thoughts they are. They do not stick because there are no true or false thoughts, as true and false are thoughts about thoughts. The difference now, thoughts are just seen, not believed. So humor and lightness is available here. The whole journey was real and was chasing a ghost at the same time. Seeking begins to collapse, and this isn't because someone stops seeking. It is because the foundation of seeking becomes questionable. The seeker cannot be found. Who arrives? If the seeker is absent, who becomes enlightened? The entire structure begins to wobble. There's a final frustration. Many seekers reach a point where every strategy fails. Reinforcing spiritual concepts, even non-duality concepts, begin to fail. Practices begin to fail. Knowledge fails. Concepts fail. Effort fails. And finally, all your resistance fails. This can feel like failure, but perhaps it is the beginning of seeing. And if you think you're going to avoid being scared, and I do mean coming face to face with the existential fear, which to me felt like absolute terror, but it can feel slightly different for everyone, but you will be scared as it brings you to the final fear barrier, and that seeker identity will not survive. Seeking consumes itself, like a fire burning its own fuel. Eventually, there's nothing left to burn. The seeking continues until it exhausts the assumption that drives it. There's no telling when that is going to happen. There's no universal signs to look for as a reference point of where you are in this process. It looks different to everyone. You have to go through this on your own, though. Perhaps someone can walk you to the ledge, but you're going to have to jump alone. No one can give someone what they already are. But you can stop confirming the story that they're not it. There's a difference between pointing versus teaching. The difference is felt in how you speak to someone who's suffering. Compassion without the savior complex, meeting people where they are without needing to get without needing them to get it. The community dimension in non-dual spaces can offer many wonderful pointings, but they often are where they recreate hierarchy as well. So you have a lot of bickering going on in non-duality forums about which path is the right path, which concept is the right concept. And this can create a lot of confusion for new seekers. So eventually, there's a breaking away from the community as well. Yet instead of your experience ending and taking this leap into the unknown, the search eventually reveals the non-existence of the searcher. Not because a seeker disappears, but because none was actually ever found. There's a joke and a gift of grace in this pathless path. The joke, you traveled the whole distance to find there was never a separate you that traveled anywhere. The gift is the journey wasn't wasted. It burned away all that was false. Seeking brought an end to the seeker, and what remains doesn't need a name. Openness to all experiences follows, and perhaps a question keeps arising in it. What is here right now before the story of you even begins? What remains? Life continues, thoughts continue, feelings continue, relationships continue, decisions continue. But the psychological center that claimed ownership becomes less convincing. The difference between knowing and seeing is that there's a statement that there is no self, and this can become another belief. Sorting out beliefs are not the point. Understanding concepts are not the point. What matters is direct observation, direct experience. Is there actually a separate entity here, or is that merely assumed? There's a great irony in this. Seeking was necessary, yet what was sought and longed for has never been absent. The search was part of the revelation. The seeker was both the journey and the obstacle. You could say, seeking did not bring me what I was looking for. Seeking revealed the one doing this looking could not be found. And in closing, I want to say, nothing was attained, nothing was added, nothing became enlightened. What ended was the unquestioned assumption that there was a separate seeker moving toward fulfillment. And a question that I'll leave you with here, if the seeker cannot be found right now, what exactly is left to seek?